I focus on, most of my research is on Southeast Asia, especially Malaysia and Singapore. And I write a lot about civil society in different aspects. So everything from the development of non-governmental organizations and other sorts of civil society organizations through Malaysian history to student activism specifically and different components of that. So for instance, I've done some research on the nature of collective identity or of nationalism or of other motivating forces behind those sorts of organizational structures. Apart from that, I've also done some research on aspects of electoral politics, from aspects like the development of opposition coalitions to the conduct of elections in different areas to the role of money politics and political networks. And then I have some work that's just more broadly on Malaysian politics. So some of that's edited work where other people contributed aspects, and some of it's my own writing. In terms of civil society, we see a different sort of development. So if we look, starting before the Merdeka era and the late colonial era, we find the development of new forms of organizational life, from trade unions to journalists associations and other forms like that in Singapore and Malaya. And that gives rise over time to a different set of organizations. So now we see the sort of contemporary NGOs around quality of life issues, around environmentalism, around human rights, around different issues, a much greater development of faith-based organizations, whether it be Dakwah organizations or Catholic organizations, Buddhist organizations, and so forth. The development of different forms of student organizations over time. If you look back at the earlier days, the campuses looked very different in terms of student life than they do now. Then all of that then has a bearing on formal political structures as well, the types of opposition parties we have, how they contest, how they build support, how they function. If we are studying students as a specific type of activist, we need to look at the setting in which they're embedded, which is the university campus itself. So in the early years of the universities, and initially there was just one in Singapore, University of Malaya, developed a branch in KL, and then everything developed from there. A very tiny proportion of the population had a tertiary education. And so students, those who were undergraduates, were specifically being trained as future elites. Most women in schools and university at that time were being trained to be teachers. The civil service was not yet open in any substantial way to women. But other positions were as leaders of industry, leaders of the economy, leaders of government. So you had all sorts of political leaders, for instance, at the time, coming to campus to exhort students to be involved with society, not to be aloof, not to be separated by a class background or by the fact that they were at that time English educated, whereas very few others were, and to be engaged in trying to lead this new nation forward. That lasts for a couple decades after independence. But as higher education becomes more normalized, as it becomes more technically focused, in other words, more of an explicit focus on practical rather than more theoretical or knowledge for knowledge sake type fields, we see a repositioning of the universities and thus of students as well. So you have both a structural repositioning of the university and a discursive, I argue in the book, a discursive repositioning of students as members of society. So with the University and University Colleges Act in the 1970s, students specifically are barred from being active in political parties, for instance, even though other youths their age could be. And so that's a reversal of the prior position. And so in that sense, students, I think, do lose a certain credibility or a certain, not necessarily in their own minds, but in terms of the stance they might make politically, they, instead of being exhorted to be involved, are enjoined against involvement. They're told that, they're too immature, that employers won't hire them if they're seen as troublemakers, that they shouldn't be getting involved in these sorts of things. So it's really a switch over time. So students then, especially by the late 1990s, and even before then, there had always been some students who still saw their role as partly political, just as a collective identity. But especially by the late 1990s, with the development of the Reformasi period, you see something of a rebirth of different types of student activism and an argument for students as having a specific role in society and in politics as citizens. Well, so part of the issue now is that the internet is not just available to students, it's available to everyone. So students who are engaged now in Malaysia are engaged less specifically as students than just as citizens. In other words, they may join human rights groups, they may join political parties, they may join alternative media, they may be bloggers, but that's not so much because they are students, which is the argument made previously. So in 1969, when the University of Malaya Student Union and the then the Socialist Club at University of Malaya had a students' manifesto for the 1969 elections and traveled the country promoting this manifesto, it was specifically as students. Now, when students take action, it's less through campus organizations, less a student council, and more often as part of a larger network. Part of that just has to do with the fact that we have both public and private universities, only since the mid-1990s. We have a lot more universities, and we have a greater range of students in terms of those who have different areas of focus, those who are on campus, different lengths of time, and so forth. If we look at students across Asia, for instance, we'll find places like Indonesia or China, where students who have taken part in political activism have done so very much specifically as students, often with a real wariness of those who are not students. So, for instance, in Indonesia, in the Reformasi period there in the late 1990s, students articulated their moral purity as students, as not self-interested, but as a reason not to ally with the urban poor, for instance, right? Because that would sully their unself-interested purity. In China, for instance, in the Tiananmen period, you had students who were also active, just as students, allying across universities but not with other groups because they feared infiltration. It's important to know who these other people are. On the converse, we have South Korea in the Mingju era, the period of the 1980s when students and workers came together to oppose authoritarianism. There, students left the university and took jobs in factories to be taken seriously as workers because that was a more useful position for what they were arguing. In Malaysia, we just see different forms of activism or different forms of identification. So it's not a better or worse. It's just, it has to do a lot with the timing, the sequencing of the development of student activism and other forms of activism. In some places, we have greater protection for activism or ideas on campus than outside. In Malaysia, I don't think that's really the case. There's not that tradition at this point. In the past there was, but now less of a tradition or less of a protection of university autonomy or academic freedom in the way that there used to be in Malaysia. One might argue that there's more of that on some of the private campuses than the public ones. And there are structural reasons for this, but a lot of it just has to do with changing laws as well. From my perspective, I like to see, just my normative position on this is just that I like to see people engaged with society. It doesn't matter to me if I don't see it as better or worse if it's as students or as concerned citizens or whatever else, but it's just nice to see people who are at that stage in their life, who are being exposed to ideas, thinking through how those ideas, how their opinions relate to problems in society, or how to see themselves as inherently political actors, whether or not they're particularly interested in politics. If you're in a place in which you have the right to vote, I'd like to see people vote, and for that vote to be informed. So I don't think it's a good or bad of what type of activity so much as just recognizing that there are different sorts of purposes that different types of activism might serve. Different political cultures, different university structures, different prevailing laws, whether the military is in charge or not, all of those dramatically shape the nature of student or youth activism. So in Thailand, for instance, we have a combination of a history of quite vehement student protest as well as academic staff protest, but you also have a strong tradition, or not strong tradition, but you have a practice of military-supported right-wing activism amongst youth in Thailand. In Indonesia, you have a combination of this very principled student protest, but that's changed a lot in some ways from the New Order era, the Orde Baru, before Suharto's ousting, and post-Reformasi. So in the pre-Reformasi period, campuses had greater protection than outside, but students still were subject to the same sorts of laws, especially what's called the Ormas, the Mass Organizations Law, that really tried to atomize society, to keep people from organizing, because that might pose a political threat. So you had these, they were called kelompok studi, these study groups among students that would move from place to place, read books, all of those sorts of things. You actually have an efflorescence of precisely that sort of organization in Malaysia now, for different reasons. Not because the military will whack you in Malaysia if you're organizing to read books and discuss them with your colleagues, but because it allows a certain flexibility, it allows a blossoming of ideas, and it's trendy, right? So in that sense, there's no single difference across these campuses. You have different timelines. There are some points of comparison. So I edited a book with a colleague at Aspinall on student activism in Asia a few years ago, and we tried to trace out some of the waves or some of the big ideas. A new left movement that we see at somewhat different starting and ending points across the region, but broadly in the 1970s, we have these ideological traditions or waves. And some of this has to do with the fact that in most areas, most countries, we have a shift toward allowing private universities to establish themselves also, starting around the 1990s, and a move toward what we term in that book a massification of higher education, which is both democratizing, now everyone can get a university education, and also diminishes the exclusive position of university students in society. When you have 40% or 80% of secondary school students going on to some sort of tertiary education, of course they're not going to have that same vaunted special place as when it was 2 or 4 or 10%. That's only natural. So for instance, the idea of Asian values, that Asians are deferential or trained to be deferential, I know plenty of Asians who are not, and everyone does, right? I mean, you think of these massive protest movements. I mean, a lot of this is essentialist and oversimplifying, and I don't think it serves much of a purpose. So for instance, if we were to look at across a range of the global north, of what's termed, you're terming as the West, we'll find a whole host of different attitudes about what children's roles should be, how outspoken one should be, this question of how polite one needs to be. So I do think that there can be training in schools, for instance, that promotes critical thinking versus rote learning, but that's not actually distinctive to Asia or the West. In other words, so much of it depends on just the specific learning traditions, the academic traditions, and look at NUS, National University of Singapore. They've promoted a conscious critical thinking curriculum since starting around the early 1990s, recognizing that they couldn't develop as they hoped to if they didn't allow critical thinking, if they stuck with the rote learning model. But part of that teaching model came from the earlier days of British education in Singapore. So I actually find it, I'm sorry if this is a overly sharp reaction to your question, but I don't find it helpful to think in those sorts of dichotomies. This is learned. It's not culturally embedded. It's not distinct to one tradition or another. I was brought up with the mantra of children should be seen but not heard, but I just had a conversation recently with an elderly Malaysian friend, Chinese Malaysian, who was saying, well, we were always told that we shouldn't speak out as children. So was I. But it's just, a lot of it has to do with what you're told in school as opposed to at home. So I find actually my own personal experience, which is inherently limited, is that there's probably less difference in the home environments than in the school environments, but that school environment is not necessarily culturally bound in the ways that a lot of the literature, a lot of commentary tends to presume. It's too changeable to seem that this is something that's related to culture rather than structure alone. For Malaysia specifically, freedom of expression is in a tenuous position right now. It's not so much the Peaceful Assembly Act, it's more this really, on the one hand, loose use of things like the Sedition Act, where even government ministers have said, well, we're not really sure what sedition is, but yet they still continue to use the act. So I find that this is a real challenge to freedom of expression and encourages self-censorship out of fear of this act. But the greater challenge, because it's not so easily remediable, is a polarization of discourse in Malaysia, which is echoed in a similar polarization in various other places. It may just be something of a global wave, I'm not sure. But the level of stereotyping, of all or nothing discussions, and the shutting down of critical engagement and dialogue in favor of sweeping pronouncements, I find to be problematic in terms of activism and engagement and discourse broadly. That said, in terms of activism widely, I don't think the amendment of one or another law is quite so consequential as just a more broad trend toward a diffusion of forms of activism, of the structures and the vehicles, the tactics used by activists. So we find everything from independent book publishing to the use of documentary film to the use of cartoons and all other literary forms, to large groups, small groups. You mentioned the internet, of course that's important, not just for information dissemination, but also for new ways of networking and new communities that can form on and offline. So on the one hand, we may have more activism that's not in person and that's less interactive, which can be a real problem in terms of building community, building collective action. But on the other hand, I think there's actually a real rejuvenation of a range of forms of activism, which is nice to see. And some of it's specifically communal, which is a long-standing tradition of Malaysia. A lot of it is not. So you have a mixture of identity-based as well as issues-based activism. No government likes demonstrations. It's just not something governments tend to like. I mean, there might be some, but just in popular engagement, yes. I mean, I think even the current government is more open to certain forms of, or some members of it, open to certain forms of engagement or involvement, discussion, inclusion, than past governments. And some of that has to do with just the unavoidability. So you have people like Hairi Jamaluddin, for instance, who holds these, meetup sessions with youth, organizing people around Twitter and so forth. All the major political parties now have some sort of, internship programs or leadership training programs or whatever it may be. Both BN and opposition do this. And so I think actually there is a greater recognition, not in the same way as before, but a greater recognition of the need to be inclusive, that's part of what's demanded. It doesn't necessarily translate into concrete policy influence. So in other words, the fact that you're being consulted doesn't mean that you're being heeded, right? But it can have that influence. I think there is a recognition that there are certain skills needed for governing, and that's part of the reason for these leadership training institutes and so forth. Some of them include really open, active discussion of current issues and that sort of thing, which I think is good. This isn't the same as the early independent years of political leaders telling the tiny proportion of university students, you are the future leaders, you must take action. Because not every university student now, quite frankly, is a future leader. But I do think that there's a recognition of the need for space for voice, that it will be taken if it's not given. But that's a gradual process. I don't think, so my own personal take is that you don't wait until somebody is mature and then say, okay, now you deserve freedom of expression. Freedom of expression helps to cultivate maturity, because in exercising that freedom, you learn to dialogue. And so that's why, for instance, I mentioned that I see not the laws, but the polarization of discourse as a more problematic constraint on freedom of expression now. Because yes, legal, the restriction of civil liberties is obviously an issue for things like freedom of expression and so forth. But if there's a resistance to dialogue, you are not able to use what freedoms you have. If others are shutting you down without engaging, that's not using expression to its full potential. That's just speaking to the converted, whatever your definition of converted may be, and cutting out other viewpoints. And so that's not something government regulates, although it can set a context that's more or less conducive to interaction and engagement. Yes, I think that there's a lot of name calling, and that's not constructive discourse, and it's on all sides. So you scapegoating an individual as sort of this person is evil, or if the goal is to get people to reject those ideas, you explain why those ideas are less desirable than others, and let there be engagement. That would be my own perspective on it. You find the same sorts of discourse if people start talking about, just they might not like some policy that relates to a given religion, and in Malaysia that can be a policy related to any given religion actually. That if the response to that is to start in the comments section on social media to just whack all things related to that religion, whatever the religion may be. That's not useful, right? And so that's one of the downsides of the fact that so much engagement now happens on social media rather than in person. People generally will be more polite, will see a response, you're forced to engage in a way when it's an in-person conversation that you are not forced to do on social media. You can unfriend somebody if you don't like their comments, but that's not the same thing as actually saying something to somebody's face. And so in that sense, I think some of this relates to feeds. It's sort of this cyclical process of developing a kind of polarization in which, some of it's formal politics, government opposition, as though they're totally different. Of course there are differences, but there are certain goals that are held in common, right? There are people that are held in common. And so just from my more academic perspective, as opposed to, I recognize the pragmatic reasons why that polarization happens, but I don't find it useful in terms of developing skills of engagement, skills of moving forward, of finding a compromise, of finding a mutual solution. If you only listen to the people that agree with you and you whack everybody else, you don't really move forward. One of the nice things about spending a lot of time in Malaysia, studying Malaysia, is that it's never the same. However much some certain structural features seem really almost permanent, in fact, there's a really constant process of evolution in all these dimensions you've asked about, which is why it's hard to answer some of these questions. So there's always a sense that, whatever's great or bad now will probably be different within 6 to 10 months, maybe a year. So there's a constant process of real change. Even when it appears that there's stasis. If you look at the nature of activism, there's a constant evolution of new forms, new vehicles, new groups, new identity categories. If we look at formal politics, we find even if the main camps seem the same, we find differences in presentation and pitch and the linkages between formal politics and the ground, all of these different aspects. And then sometimes, like right now, we find more obvious changes, parties dissolving or coalitions dissolving or leadership in crisis, but there's always something. So that makes it very exciting. So tradition, there's always a sense, tradition doesn't change, tradition is permanent. Tradition, everything changes. So when we talk about culture, we're talking not about a fixed entity, but about something that's constantly evolving. So it does seem that Malaysia is known for communal orientations, but those are not so fixed as much of the literature, much of conventional wisdom would assume. And so we find with globalization, with Malaysians moving overseas, with migration to Malaysia, with different exposure to different places, with since the NEP era, the dissociation of occupation from ethnicity, we find that different class identities or different gendered identities or whatever other identities are increasingly displacing or complementing those of ethnicity, for instance. So I think it's a very difficult thing to try to pin down what the specific, which I'm not just trying to be evasive, I really think this, to pin down what the salience of an ethnic identity is and what that means to any given person.